Chapter 50, The Aborigines, Section 9. The advances towards the final extinction of the natives have been more rapid than was expected, but the certainty of that event was never the subject of doubt. Sir George Murray, on the 5th November, 1830, anticipated and wrote down their fate, and inferred from their decrease that at no distant period the whole race would become extinct. But he declared that the adoption of any course of conduct with this design, either avowed or secret, would leave an indelible stain upon the government of Great Britain. It will be seen, however, that the progress of decay was never arrested for a moment. The mortality at Bruny and Swan Islands was not less than at Flinders, but from 1832 a regular account has been preserved. Of the 45 landed at Oyster Cove in 1847, 13 were men, 22 women, and 10 children. Such has been the progress of their decline, and with numbers so inconsiderable, the problem of their fate is solved. The original amount of the natives has been a question much debated. Like a procession in a circle, a population in motion, when not personally distinguished, will appear more numerous than the actual census. Mr. Kelly, who often had passed the coasts, calculated them at originally 7,000, but he guessed their number to be 5,000 in 1830. The obvious error of the last estimate would naturally suggest a doubt with reference to the former. Several hundreds were, however, seen in one assembly within the last 30 years. At Hobart Town and Launceston, from 1 to 200 have appeared together. It was their custom to distribute themselves in parties of from 40 to 50 each. Their fires, kindled on the seashore, were often left burning when they had moved on to the next stage, and those who saw the flames from shipboard concluded that Aborigines were lying around them, and thus telling their numbers by the fires, they were often greatly deceived. The rapidity of their movements led to the same mistake. They appeared at places sufficient to establish an alibi according to the current measures of distance. They had innumerable paths which shorten a journey, then unknown to the English. It was thus that they were twice reckoned, even when carefully counted. No reliance, however, will be placed by persons of experience on the rumor of numbers. Nearly all who report an assembly judge by imagination rather than minute inspection. Thus, mobs are spoken of as tens or hundreds of thousands, without any intention to mislead. It will be the hope of the humane that the lowest estimate is the true one. It can hardly be doubted, however, that they were originally from 4,000 to 5,000. They were estimated by Mr. Robinson at 700 when he commenced his mission. 203 were captured. Many, in the meantime, fell by unknown violence and perpetual persecution. 1,000 muskets were charged for their destruction. The causes of their diminution in Tasmania have been already stated, but some of these continued their operation even after the capture. Their natural consequences followed. Towards the last days of their savage life, the sexes were disproportionate, although the balance was partly restored by associating the women who had been longer in captivity with the men whose wives had died. But many of these women had become licentious, and by an extraordinary oversight, the government permitted unmarried convicts and others to have them in charge or to assist in the preliminary labor of their establishment. The result need not be told. The infant children had perished by the misery or contrivance of their parents. Thus, in 1838, of 82, there were only 14 children, and of the remainder, 8 had attained the usual term of human life. Many who surrendered were exhausted by sickness, fatigue, and decrepitude. They were the worn-out relics of their nation, and they came in to lie down and die. The assumption of clothing occasioned many deaths. They were sometimes drenched with rain. Perspiration was repressed, and inflammatory diseases followed. The licentiousness and occasional want of the few last. Years generated disorders which a cold brought to a crisis. Among savages, the blanket has sometimes slain more than the sword. It destroyed the Indian of North America and even threatened the New Zealander with a similar fate. The abundant supply of food, and which followed destitution, tended to the same result. It was a different diet. The habits of the chase were superseded and perhaps discouraged. The violent action to which they had been accustomed, the dancing, shouting, hurling the waddy and the spear, climbing for the opossum, diving and leaping from rock to rock, assisted the animal functions and developed muscular power. To continue them required the occasion as well as the permission, but the stimulus was gone. It is said by writers not favourable to the establishment at Flinders, which attempts to force the customs and habits of a civilized people were unreasonably and even ridiculously severe. However docile the blacks and generous the intention of their teachers, the physical effects of a total change in the habits of a race are not to be disputed, or that what may be harmless when the result of choice and founded on new mental and physical stimulants is dangerous when the mind is vacant and the objects of civilized exertion unappreciated. Perhaps no one is blamable. In their social circumstances, we may indeed trace the occasion of decay, but they were no longer produced by cruelty. There were other causes. The site of the settlement was unhealthy. They were often destitute of good water. The tanks preserved an insufficient supply. It is admitted that they frequently suffered this lack, but it is stated that they had sufficient allowed them when sick. It is, however, clear that many perished by that strange disease, so often fatal to the soldiers and peasants of Switzerland who die in foreign lands from regret of their native country. They were within sight of Tasmania, and as they beheld its not distant but forbidden shore, they were often deeply melancholy. To this point, the testimony of Mr. Robinson is decisive, though not solitary. They suffered much from mental irritation. When taken with disease, they often refused sustenance and died in delirium. The wife, or the husband in perfect health, when bereaved, would immediately sicken and rapidly pine away. Count Strzelecki has propounded a curious notion of the laws of extinction. In reference to this race, he states that the mother of a half-caste can never produce a black child, and thus the race dies. His statement would need the most positive and uniform testimony, but it may be added to the curiosities of literature. The decrease of population among the inferior race, when harassed or licentious, is certain. But surely there is nothing occult in this or requiring further explanation than is afforded by human cruelty and vice. Among those who survive is the wife of the native Walter George Arthur, the half-caste daughter of Sarah, an Aboriginal woman. Looking lately at a picture of Don Quixote, she pointed him out as the man who fought with the windmill. Her mother has a younger son, now or lately at the Queen's School, and of pure Aboriginal blood. A natural law by which the extinction of a race is predicted will not admit of such serious deviations. In 1844, a finance committee of the Legislative Council proposed the restoration of the natives to this colony. The frequent reference to headquarters by the officers in charge perplexed the government, who alleged that the distance permitted the oppression of the natives and exposed them to the caprice of their guardians. The measure was delayed for 4 years, but in 1847 the dismissal of the commandant revived the project, and in October of that year they were landed in Van Diemen's Land and located at Oyster Bay, once a great station of their people. The removal was unacceptable to the colonists. The outrages of former years were remembered by many as scenes of domestic mourning. No murmur had ever been heard at the cost of their safety. It was deemed a small atonement for a national wrong, nor will it be possible to state an expenditure which the colonial public would be unwilling to sustain. To smooth the last hours of this unfortunate race, the transfer of a part to Port Phillip had been attended with fatal consequences to several, and had ended in murder and executions. It was feared that the vicinity of their former haunts might revive their habits of wandering, and once more expose them to those gangs of felons who set no value on Aboriginal life. These sentiments led to a spirited remonstrance, in which many respectable settlers concurred. The government had not anticipated opposition, or it may be presumed that a statement of the actual condition of the natives and the provision intended for their safety would have preceded this change in their abode. The dark shadows of former years threw doubt on their present character. Happily, however, these impressions were erroneous. The few who remain are not likely to forsake the comforts of their home. Belonging to various tribes and different dialects, particular districts do not present equal attractions to all. They have learned also to rear vegetables, and the greater number are said to be familiar with English customs. By the census, they are assigned to the Church of England. But the distinctions of theology are beyond their comprehension, and therefore their choice, and it is perhaps to be lamented that from the period of their capture, they have not been placed entirely under the parental care of some religious communion. Those who think lightly of missionary institutions will find here no ground for exultation in the disastrous surveillance of the civil government. Englishmen, of whatever rank, cannot fail to survey the Aboriginal youth, less in number than many a colonial household, with deep solicitude, or when estimating their claims, to remember the fortunes of their fathers. Or should their helplessness and dependence ever tempt a ruler to expose them to the corrupting influence of the lowest examples, and to assign them the meanest education, he may be recovered to some sense of justice by the following confession of a distinguished predecessor. Undoubtedly, the being reduced to the necessity of driving a simple but warlike, and, as it now appears, noble-minded race from their native hunting grounds is a measure in itself so distressing that I am willing to make almost any prudent sacrifice that may tend to compensate for the injuries that government is unwillingly and unavoidably the instrument of inflicting. George Arthur. End of Chapter 50, being the Aborigines, Section 9.